Hi everyone, and welcome to my final paper preliminary outline. I'm Luke Shoemaker, and I'm talking about fostering environmental consciousness in secondary students. I'll be focusing on Australia and Costa Rica. So children growing up today, they face uncertain ecological futures, and that can bring a sense of apprehensive urgency to their world. This is brought upon by um, what scientists have warned of as the changes to Earth's system since tipping into the Anthropocene, which is the era in which humans are acting as a geological force, changing Earth's natural systems. And this really presents the emergence of the delusion in the business as usual environmental education, which we currently have, and it perpetuates human stewardship narratives and implicit human exceptionalist assumptions, or assumptions that humans essentially have broken loose from Earth's natural systems, and um, that delusion there. So we have the necessity to reconfigure the paradigm and how humans understand themselves as ecological agents on a damaged Earth. So the topic statement here is how secondary science teachers in Australia and Costa Rica understand and implement curriculum pedagogy as part of environmental education efforts to foster environmental consciousness in discipline science classes. So science classes such as biology, chemistry, and physics. The key term here is environmental consciousness, which is understood as being a complex product, influenced by one's personal values and personality traits. But it's also influenced by external factors, and I'll be defining it as a measure of a person's ability to understand the nature of environmental processes and problems, his concern for environmental quality, and the extent to which he or she is committed to positive environmental behavior in everyday life. Context for this review of the literature is provided with SDG 4.7, which deals with sustainable development and global citizenship, as well as Visionary Statement 2, which reads that by 2050 we have fully acknowledged that humans are embedded within ecosystems, and that we are ecological, not just social beings. All curricula and pedagogies are now firmly grounded in ecological consciousness. My motivation for focusing on science curriculum is just from my personal background, so I've always kind of understood that maybe a well-rounded science educational experience goes beyond studying like the natural world out there, and it also tends to have a very selective narrative of scientific progress and what that looks like, and grounding in ecological consciousness, I feel would part of that would involve students being able to critically engage in what the scientific process looks like, and what is positive and what is not in terms of being an ecological agent. The significant statement is this will address the lacuna existing between scholarly literature and day-to-day discourses of environmental education in classrooms. So this lacuna exists in many nations, but particularly in Australia. The government has adopted a clear mandate for integration of sustainability across all learning areas in Australian schools. However, this sustainability education can still be seen as competing for space with like the traditional curriculum, and also, many teachers don't have background in sustainability, right? So they don't have a clear understanding of what that means. As well as in Costa Rica, we see tensions between educators on what is the most appropriate content and orientation of environmental education programs. So by reviewing this literature, I hope to get questions and recommendations for further research that can address, the barriers to, reaching the visionary statement and the sustainable development goal. And our question that needs to be answered is, how does the understanding and implementation of curriculum and pedagogy among secondary science teachers in Costa Rica and Australia successfully foster environmental consciousness? So we Environmental consciousness has societal benefits such as environmentally friendly buying behavior. It's also an effort to provide a more holistic science educational experience, which scholars argue is critical in this era's huge demand for local global approaches to complex socio-scientific scenarios. And then the majority of research on environmental education fails to move beyond the human stewardship narratives. They either don't make that goal explicit of moving beyond those narratives, or they perpetuate human stewardship narratives. So we to move towards a visionary statement, we need perhaps to review what direction current literature is taking. Costa Rica will provide especially valuable insights because this is a nation that may be perhaps further along in environmental education. And, this is because the country itself relies on ecotourism and has national recognition of the value of understanding humans' essential role in ecological health. Australia will provide insights in that it has the clear mandate for environmental education, but we want to understand further the barriers present and how teachers conceptualize this. So my organization statement, I'll first present the background and the arguments of discovery that I formed from the data. Then secondly, how I formed the argument of advocacy, and I used a sociological perspective. Finally, a critique of the literature and the counter-arguments, the thesis statement, a short analysis of the thesis with examples, and the implications. So from the data, we see that successfully fostering environmental consciousness within secondary students requires, first, that students engage in socially relevant and tangible experiences that situate environmental issues within an economic and social context. So this is seen with various pieces of evidence, but two in particular are, Selby and colleagues found that overall Costa Rican students thought seriously and in intersectional ways about local environmental issues and how the issues affect them and the community in a case study. And Ser and Dow found that 69% of Australian students who were not involved in environmental activities at school stated that they would like to be, which kind of lends itself to suggesting a more hands-on active learning work addressing local authentic issues is identified by students as something that is relevant to them. Secondly, the successfully fostering environmental consciousness requires teachers to engage in a reframing of mainstream curriculum. So this is in the idea that mainstream curriculum perpetuates that narrative of science that is grounded in Western progress and development, and the practices of unpacking the science is very limited. Also, typically mainstream science curriculum has a very limited societal perspective to it. And a lot of times we argue it's pure science, but 90% of secondary students agree, or mostly agree, that a chemistry lesson framed around a societal perspective was interesting, and that's coming from Sabata and colleagues. And thirdly, students are required to engage in participatory learning pedagogies. This is capitalizing on the social nature of learning, but it's also, has to deal with the some of the competencies that environmental consciousness involves. Stems best from participatory learning pedagogies versus traditional pedagogies. So the advocacy argument that answers the posed question, so coming from the arguments of discovery, reads that based on the literature surveyed, although variation exists in how Australian and Costa Rican teachers conceptualize environmental education in the context of mainstream curricula and human stewardship narratives, clear pedagogical successes to fostering environmental consciousness emerge, and include the necessity of tangible experiences with social relevance and participatory collaborative learning. Okay, and to critique that argument or the thesis, I just present some counter arguments. So, for example, in contrast to tangible experiences of social relevance, we may have blame-based environmental education, which can leave students feeling disillusioned and uninterested. That's what the literature suggests on that. And exposure to environmental issues without the opportunity to work towards positive change can risk students developing a learned sense of helplessness or experiencing conceptual avoidance. And addressing the participatory collaborative learning, traditional lectures may not give students the opportunity to become actively engaged in a teaching learning process, and they also don't capitalize on the social nature of learning. And as I said, that's problematic because some of the competencies of environmental consciousness are best addressed through that social pedagogy. Students need to engage critically with their own values and find role models that can help develop that environmental consciousness. So in summation, this was the thesis statement that I formed from the arguments of discovery. Some analysis of the key parts. So, there is variation in how teachers conceptualize education, environmental education in the context of mainstream curriculum. So, for example, some educators in Costa Rica promote a style of environmental education that is focused on learning in the natural sciences, while other programs attend to the linkages between human and ecological communities. In terms of human stewardship, significant numbers of Australian educators describe environmental education, as recycling programs, composting, and being water-wise. Those can be important components, but as saying those are like the fundamental components of environmental education, that's really just that narrow human stewardship narrative, while others focused on development of values. So there's variation there that we need to address. And then the clear pedagogical successes include the tangible experiences with social relevance. So again, this is providing students with a sense of agency in contributing to sustainable livelihood of their community, both their social and ecological communities, even though that dichotomy is really really doesn't exist. We're contributing to both of those. So, and also the collaborative learning again fosters, values such as like empathy and change of perspective, responsibility and ethics, and personal involvement. The study suggests that successfully fostering environmental consciousness in this context of SDG 4.7 requires that environmental education programs situate environmental issues within local social and environmental context, and that they engage students in positive action. So this has implications for further efforts in environmental education. And also we need to address the barriers to teacher education, such as teachers will need to reach an understanding of what it means to ground curriculum and pedagogy in ecological consciousness. Add-on materials provided by outside stakeholders can serve as valid starting points, but will fail to make up an effective educational experience because this it just doesn't capture what environmental education, the necessary components, need to have. So ultimately, the need emerges that teachers engage in reframing of mainstream curriculum. Okay, but thank you for listening, and here are the references.